There's the induction happening now as well.
I'm Zoe, so I'll do the
So explain to you afterwards.
So might be enough.
Okay, cool, thanks.
So for all the new people, I guess. Sorry, induction views. Okay, so Amy's now going to give a wonderful talk about her PhD and the PPI and what's the word? The co-production. Co-production, that's the word I'm trying to say. The co-production that she's doing there. So take it away.
Okay, cool. Hello, everyone. I know lots of you, but for anyone new, I am Amy and I'm a PhD student here in TARG. And today I'm going to speak about patient and public involvement, or PPI, and the impact that it's had on my PhD. And so for those of you that have been around for a while, I came and spoke about the importance of PPI before. And so I'm not going to repeat that. I'm just going to say what I've done and the impact that it's had on my work. There we go. So my PhD title is the role of genetics in the relationship between parenting and mental health. Obviously, that's a huge area with many potential research questions in it. So I decided to consult with and collaborate with people who have lived experience of depression and anxiety and to decide on my specific research questions. So I have so far hosted a focus group and I recruited people with lived experience of depression and anxiety. So they were either a parent who had depression or anxiety, the adult child of a parent who had depression or anxiety, or people that work with those parents. I recruited via the BRC public engagement mailing list, and I had 9 people come along to my focus group. I was very lucky in terms of the diversity of viewpoints that was represented. So I had a wide age range of people, men and women were present, and various ethnicities and cultural backgrounds were represented, and people were all ticked the lived experience box, but they were diverse in terms of whether they were the parent, child, both of those, or whether they'd worked with people in the mental health field generally as well. And so we had a 2-hour focus group online that was facilitated by somebody else so that I didn't steer the conversation to where I wanted it to go. And for the first 90 minutes, we discussed what people thought the causes of depression and anxiety were. It didn't matter if that was rooted in reality, it was just what they thought and their personal explanations of their experiences. And then for the last 30 minutes, we distilled that down into their research priorities and specific research questions they might be interested in. So this discussion was recorded and transcribed, and then I analysed it using reflexive thematic analysis, or the best attempt that I could do at that, because it's very, very complicated. But in the spirit of reflexivity, I think it's important to note that I approached this inductively. I didn't have any hypotheses. I wasn't looking for anything. I hadn't even done that much kind of specific reading. So in order not to steer myself into anything I was interested in, but I'm doing a PhD in this area. I'd like to think I know quite a bit about it. So that's likely to have influenced the themes that I drew out and how I constructed them. But the transcript, I would hope people would read it and see where I got that from. Just to be transparent with that. So what did I find? And to give a bit of context, most participants came agreeing with my viewpoint, although it wasn't shared with them beforehand, that both genetic and environmental factors, including parenting, are likely to play a causal role in the development of depression and anxiety. It's also important to point out that some people did come thinking it was purely environmental or mainly environmental, and that when people elaborated on causes, even the people who had endorsed genetics as being quite heavily involved, they didn't then elaborate on that. They said, yeah, I think it's probably something genetic. That was the end of that conversation. But when we elaborated on environmental causes, it became much more nuanced. People brought up their personal experiences and anecdotes, and that was the bulk of the conversation. And that's where I identified the 4 themes that I saw as present within the data. So the first theme was feeling loved and wanted by your parents during childhood. This came up almost immediately, was endorsed by every single person there, and reoccurred throughout the conversation, as well as in the kind of final 30 minutes bit where we distilled research priorities. And people saw a lack of love as a risk factor for developing depression or anxiety, or kind of exacerbating this intergenerational transmission. They also spoke about sometimes misperceiving people going through a bout of depression or anxiety and maybe their parent withdrawing from them, or kind of, which might have been a protective action, almost withdrawing from exposing their child to whatever mental health problems they're going through. As a child, they might have misinterpreted that as a lack of love. And now that they're adults, they can see that it was just mental health playing a role in their life. But now, as a child, the childhood interpretation is still there. And then conversely, the presence of love was seen as something very protective and something that could stop the intergenerational transmission of mental health or be a buffer against any trauma that people might have experienced. The second theme was trauma and hardship. So individual traumatic events, complex trauma that might be experienced across the life course over an extended period of time, and then things that I and other people within the focus group conceptualize as kind of difficult life circumstances. So what I'm talking about there is things like poverty, not growing up in a nice area. They might be conceptualized as traumatic as well. But these had an impact on people's perception of whether they would develop depression or anxiety or not, and acted as a risk factor. But they also spoke about it on the level of intergenerational transmission and how a parent or a grandparent's traumatic experience or experience of hardship might then be passed on from to child to grandchild. And then we have the third theme of personality, which is spoken about on 2 levels as well. So people spoke about how certain personalities were maybe at higher risk of developing depression or having a kind of a resilient personality. And they didn't necessarily distill what specific personality characteristics those might be. There was a little bit of talk of kind of introversion, extroversion, but I think that was more of like an example than picking apart specific personality characteristics. But how I interpreted a lot of the conversation around personality was kind of gene environment interplay coming into the conversation, because people thought of personality as your nature, something that you're born with. I know that within personality research, the heritability estimate is something like 40%. So that's not entirely true, but people's kind of conception of personality is that it's something that you're born with. And so I think this quote sums it up really nicely. I think it's deeply relevant to how we respond during our own circumstances as individuals. So you've got this personality, which is DNA driven, you get your life circumstances, and then the output is kind of your risk of developing depression or anxiety or the level of resilience that you have. And that's going to be different for everybody, even if they have similar circumstances. And then the fourth theme was family characteristics, and family structure was kind of the biggest part of this. Are you from a 2 or a single parent family? Where do you like kind of come in sibling position? One participant also spoke about how within her perception of her kind of cultural influence on her family was that she didn't come to the family as an individual, and you came as someone that was fulfilling a role that your family needed you to fulfill. And then her interpretation of that was that it might have had a negative impact on her and her parents' mental health. And I think that this theme is really important to draw out as a parenting researcher, because for a good reason, parenting research focuses often on the dyad, because you're trying to pick out what about this parent has an impact on this child. But obviously, even if you live in a family where it's just one parent and one child, so it is a dyad, there's so much more having an impact on that. And I had many prompts, because I'm a parenting researcher, trying to get back to this dyad. And what about you and your mum? What about you and your dad? How did that have an influence? And people would speak about, well, me and my mum did this, but then they'd say, and then my sibling came along and did this, or like we had a pet. It was never an isolated dyad thing. And then you've got wider kind of influences like culture and society as well. So those are my 4 themes. That's my data. What am I going to do with it? My initial plan had been to have one question that mapped onto each of the 4 themes, but that it kind of became apparent would be too ambitious and I probably wouldn't get it finished and there wouldn't really be a clear narrative within my PhD. And so I've decided to focus on one of the themes, and I've decided to focus on the subjective feeling of being loved in childhood and its potential kind of protective characteristics or a potential risk factor if you don't feel loved. And that's partly because I personally find it really interesting and it comes into my personal narrative a lot, but I also think that it's the least represented within the literature of the 4 themes that I've presented. And I also to note here that I will continue to have PPI as a theme throughout my PhD. So I'm in the process of co-producing a piece with the focus group members. I'll continue to get feedback from them and I'll continue to co-produce research outputs as well. So now I'll tell you what my PhD is going to look like based on this. Because genetics is a major kind of part of my PhD, the first place to start is investigating the genetic architecture of feeling loved. So I'll do a genome-wide association study of feeling loved using UK Biobank data. So there's a single item in there, to what extent did you feel loved as a child? It's answered by something like 150,000 people. So hopefully that will be relatively well powered. And then I will estimate the SNP-based heritability of feeling loved, either using GCTA or LD-PRED. That's currently undecided based on which sample I use. And then I will switch to ALSPAC data and use GCTA to look at genetic correlations between feeling loved and depressive symptoms, anxiety symptoms, well-being, whether you have a mental health diagnosis or not, and personality characteristics. So that is the first study, and another output of that study will be to construct a polygenic score for feeling loved, which will feed into my next 2 studies, which are trying to tap into causal associations between feeling loved and depression and anxiety, which are my mental health phenotypes, using Mendelian randomization. So Mendelian randomization is a type of analysis where you use a polygenic score as a proxy for a phenotype, and in that way you can randomize people to that phenotype theoretically and under certain assumptions, and you can look at causal associations because these associations should be free of confounding, reverse causation, and all of the normal biases that come into observational epidemiology. So I am going to do bidirectional MR to see whether the relationship between feeling loved and having depression goes in one direction, the other direction, or is truly bidirectional. I'll do that using individual level ALSPAC data, and then I'll repeat that with anxiety as an exposure/outcome as well. And then my final study is to do 2-step MR, which is analogous to like mediation analysis. So I will have maternal depression or parental depression as my exposure, offspring feeling loved in childhood as my mediator, offspring depression as my outcome, again using individual level ALSPAC data, and again repeating it for anxiety as well. And that's everything that I've got planned so far. I do have other ideas, but I think it's likely that this will take me the rest of my PhD. So you're welcome to ask me what my other ideas are if you want to. But for the moment, that is everything from me. So if anyone has any questions, I'd like to thank you all for listening.
Thank you very much. Very interesting. Does anybody have any questions for Amy? Back? Yeah.
That's really interesting. I'm really interested in the idea of the GWAS for feeling love. I'm wondering how that would overlap with other GWAS that have been done for other mental health. So perhaps, depression.
Yeah.
So what's going to be the overlap between that and the other GWAS that have gone before it, and how are you going to look at that?
So I think that it will massively overlap with depression, and that was one of the main things that almost put me off doing this research. There's actually one of the depressive symptom measure that I'll do the genetic correlations with in ALSPAC. One of the items on that measure is do you feel loved at the moment, because it's asked in a kind of on the past 2-week basis. So I would expect quite a bit of overlap there. And so I'll investigate it using the genetic correlations. I'll probably also look up common SNPs between those, maybe look at to what extent the polygenic score for feeling love predicts depression and vice versa. And I think that the other thing is potentially just to raise it as a huge limitation of this whole PhD, but also of depression phenotypes. That's something that has become kind of increasingly obvious to me as I've gone through my PhD, that when we do GWAS and other genetic analyses, we're doing them using imperfect phenotypes that are based on phenotypic level to try and tap into this genotype biological level. And yeah, I think it's just going to be a big part of my discussion, but I'm open to any other ideas of how I can get around that.
It'd be really interesting in terms of sort of saying, obviously if it overlaps, you find expecting that, I guess.
Yeah.
Doesn't overlap, how do you interpret that?
Yeah, it would almost point to something having gone wrong, potentially.
There was another question.
Mark, did you have a question?
Yeah, Mark.
Just gonna ask for your own ideas.
Okay. No, this wasn't planned at all. But okay, so one of my other ideas is just to tap into this feeling of being loved in childhood. What does that mean? What would that look like? What are, because a lot of things, like people will say like, oh, these are retrospective measures and subjective measures, but that's actually what I'm trying to tap into. And so, yeah, I'd like to do some work. Maybe if I end up waiting for data for ages, I will end up doing some quali work about just what the hell is this concept. And the other idea is to look at kind of family-based designs, and one that I've been kind of toying around with, I think we brought it up in Dreamstone meetings before, is looking at how genetic nurture effects could be investigated using family designs, and looking at how maybe if you have a single parent versus a grown up in a 2-parent family home, will the single parent's impact be larger than a 2-parent impact? Because you would expect that if they're having more control over your environment. That's not entirely clear, but yeah, that's partly because I haven't thought of it all yet, but that's what I'd like to do. But that would involve using MOVA data, which is more complex to get your hands on.
Interesting.
Yeah, I wanted to ask about, you mentioned in the focus group that you, at the last bit, you asked the participants about their priorities for research. And I wondered what came up there, like what did the participants want you or, researchers to research?
It kind of was just a continuation of what we discussed in the previous 90 minutes, and some of it, like one person was like basically just put the 4 themes in one research question and was like, yeah, I think we should do that. I was like, yeah, that would be lovely, but also I physically can't. I don't know if anyone else can, but I definitely can't answer that question. It was something like, so we've got our personality and then we feel loved, and some parents have a favorite child, and if you've got 2 siblings in your household, how would that then like loop back to your personality and whether you get depressed or not? I was like, okay, brilliant. But yeah, people brought back the feeling love thing in this, and people also used it as more time to just discuss what they thought the causes were. And yeah, I think that was, I didn't expect that to necessarily come out with some specific research questions, but people didn't really volunteer that much, which I think is probably quite a normal experience because people aren't used to bringing conversations into a question in the same way that we would kind of have practice doing. But yeah, very similar stuff to what I had kind of presented.
I really like that you used feeling loved as a term, like, because I think it's so easy with sort of psychology to get, secure attachment and unconditional physical love, whereas actually what we're talking about is love. So it's just really nice to see that in a research context. And you said you were interested in what does actually this mean, the kind of the feeling love thing, and so my question's to do with that. So thinking from a sort of like therapy point of view, people often report feeling very loved despite being in abusive relationships. And I was wondering if you're going to be looking at any other measures of like emotional neglect, domestic abuse or anything alongside the self-reported scores, because sometimes it can be it's like a protected, like it's very hard to admit that actually you're feeling very unloved.
Yeah. So another like potential round of ideas that I had was doing more observational stuff where I look at things like there's an ALSPAC measure of when the mum's expecting the baby. Do you want this baby? Do you love this baby? How does that map onto whether the child feels it when they're age 24 and they're looking back on their childhood? And then there's more objective measures of things like parental warmth and interaction-y based stuff. But yeah, I don't have any immediate plans but that's another thing that will be done if I have time, just kind of mapping out almost the like network of how does feeling loved map onto all of these other things in a situational context, because I'm doing that with mental health phenotypes. But yeah, what does your environment have to look like for you to feel like that?
This might be a silly question, and to be honest, a lot of the clever mathsy stuff is a bit over my head. So
It's over my head too.
And there's something interesting about disentangling, like conceptually feeling love and depression, and like trying to work out a causal relationship, because you could wonder if the capacity of feeling love is associated with the other symptoms, which we sort of put together and diagnose as depression. And is there a way of disentangling that, whether it's sort of a causal thing or whether it's part of the condition?
Yeah, I don't know. I suppose that will partly come from looking at things like genetic correlations and shared kind of genetic hits that come out of the GWAS. I also think that, yeah, with this, what I'm partly thinking is, yes, a lot of people who feel depressed will also have difficulty with that feeling of loved, and that can come into their depression. But if you're just thinking of the core symptoms of depression, that's not one of them. If I was to think of a psychological concept onto which this would fit, it might be something more like self-esteem. And so part of what like I would be trying to do in anything kind of genetic is distill down what is that underpinning thing, what is depression outside of feeling loved. So I don't think any of mine are specifically aimed. I don't know if there is an analysis that could disentangle these two things, but it's something that I'll be mindful of in every interpretation that I do. And yeah, maybe something that I can try to be mindful of. I think that's the biggest problem of this PhD, disentangling those two things.
Just to follow up on that one quickly as well. I don't know, are you doing bidirectional or not? I don't know if that would help in any way to.
Yeah.
I also, are you on the MR mental health group? They were doing talks, and sure they're going to start again, but they might have some ideas about how to.
Okay, yeah, no, I'm not.
Can I have to check my emails, but yes.
Okay.
I have this, the question I had was, you in ALSPAC, you're just looking at maternal mental health, because obviously the father's data there's less of them. I don't know how it would just be an issue, but I just wondered if you sort of thought about that and how I guess from sort of previous stages, like how maternal, paternal sort of parenting, is it quite different impacts or?
There has been some research where fathers have kind of been used as and it is ALSPAC based as well, as a kind of negative control and stuff like that, because I think it is that typical, like they're kind of a little bit older, gender stereotypes are probably playing more of a part in ALSPAC families than they are maybe today, or would be. But I think that's just something I'm going to have to decide based on power. If I can get better power by including dads, then I will, and if that's kind of feasible and something that I can do, I will just include parents and look at parental depression as opposed to maternal depression. I'm just often in the habit of saying maternal because everything I've done has been maternal to this point.
I know we have more questions in the room, but do have some chat.
So we have one question from Sally. Sally, I don't know if you want to ask this yourself and unmute and speak from the ether, or whether you want me to ask on your behalf.
Yeah, that's fine.
Oh, quiet there.
Oh, can you hear me?
Just 1 second, it says.
Oh, okay.
Go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, so it was a really interesting talk, I thought, and it's obviously a really interesting topic. And I'm quite naive to genetics and like parental research, but I was wondering, the item of feeling loved, like in terms of, because it's a single item, like how much can that really tell you? Because surely like feeling loved is more complex than what like a single item can capture. Obviously, like trying to measure it is really difficult anyway, but I wondered if there's like, other measures you could combine to try and get a general, like a more general sense of feeling of how they felt loved.
Yeah, I think that the fact that it's a single item and something quite basic is, again, just a big limitation of this work. But I think also that's partly that's literally all I'm trying to tap into at the moment, and especially without this kind of knowledge of what that would be like, what that would look like. And like, as we've kind of discussed already, it's already so complex to disentangle that one thing from depression that I would worry that adding more things in and making a multi-item measure, which maybe wasn't so kind of distinct and clear, would complicate the issue even more. But one potential output of any work that I could do could be a measure of feeling loved, or a measure of love in childhood, or a measure of experiences of love, or something like that, which was more I don't know, an actual good measure of the thing. Yeah, I don't know what other items I would kind of combine with this.
Yeah, it's really hard thing to try and measure, I think, because it's such an abstract thing. Obviously it means something different to everyone, and
Yeah,
it has like really individualistic influences. But yeah, like you said, it probably would make it more complicated, but maybe this could inform like future work that you do, you know, in terms of, you know, if people didn't feel love, like why wouldn't they, and if they did, then, you know, why would they? But yeah, thank you, that's really interesting.
thank you.
Great, so I think Robbie was next.
Yeah, that actually going to give you a different question. So I think I'll ask the new one. Actually.
You can ask both if you want.
Okay, well, the first question was, I was wondering, did you have like a kind of conception of the shape the research would take pre-PPI? Like, I'm wondering the extent to which it's guided the thesis.
So I've always been personally interested in this, and I wanted to look at whether I saw this feeling loved item in ALSPAC, and I wanted to look at how well it predicted depression. And when I was doing my mini projects, and I was like going through the ALSPAC items, but I had it planned as like a postdoc or something, or like if I got to supervise like a master's student or something within my PhD, it's something that I just found personally interesting and was like, nah, this isn't relevant to my PhD. Like, I'm going to be looking at other things. And so then I was like shocked by the extent to which it came up in the focus group. And it's a good job that I wasn't the one facilitating it, because then I would be sitting here like, oh, I must have just steered it to that, because that's what I'm really interested in too. But a lot of that interest also comes from my lived experience. So yeah, I think maybe I'm naive and completely biased, but I think that the PPI has had a major impact. I never would have had my PhD centering around love if I hadn't done that focus group, no matter how interested I was in it as a person.
And then, yeah, I guess the second question was, I was wondering the extent to which this research is guided by kind of purely theoretical interest, or with some like further aims to having kind of, you know, utilitarian practical implications.
Yes, so I think like, because it is so first stage and there's not a lot of research looking at this, and within genetic epidemiology and epidemiology in general, it is quite like far removed from the end result. But I do think that if I found a protective impact of feeling loved in childhood, I think that there's a lot of practical applications that could be done with that in terms of interventions, in terms of messaging to new parents, in terms of messaging to people who are stressed about, like, am I the perfect parent? So much narrative now goes around, this is what you should do as a parent, this is what you shouldn't do as a parent, you should read all these books while you're pregnant. You know, if you are not securely attached, you're at risk of all of these different things. Whereas if, and I mean, hopefully I will, I really want to find that feeling loved protects you against depression. Obviously I'm not in control of whether I will find that or not, but if that was the finding, I think that would just be a really like simple message to put across to parents and children of like, love is kind of a powerful process within the parent-child relationship and mental health development, but also could come into a lot of interventions and inform a lot of interventions, because a lot of interventions do currently center around attachment, bonding, all of that kind of thing in babyhood, and whether they're effective or not remains to be seen.
Angela, did you have a question?
Yeah, mine was actually more about your approach to the PPI. There's sort of 3 elements struck me on the slide. I think I've got the same question for them, which is kind of how did you choose to do it that way, and the costs and benefits, and 3 were online versus in person. Is that pragmatic, what the rationale there? The second one was something else that was Can you go back to the slide? Yeah, focus group versus in.
Yeah.
And then the third one, if I saw it right, you said that it was professional and lived experience. So I wondered if you had them in the same focus group, why and what factors into the whole experience. So those 3 things: online interviews versus focus group in relationship experience.
Yeah, so online was purely pragmatic. I originally wanted it to be in person, but people couldn't like make the time. They didn't, it was still like quite, COVID was over, but not as over as it is now. So people didn't want to expose themselves to COVID and all that kind of thing. So I just was like, we'll have it online if people are more comfortable with that. Focus group versus interview, that was kind of just like, I have no idea how this is going to go. And I hoped that people would bounce off one another, because I felt very like not confident about running this thing and discussing my research and like making prompts and everything. And I was like, I just want to see what I get back. And so it was the kind of aims of this were to inform my PhD, but also I've been like really interested in PPI since my master's, when I first like heard about it as a concept. So it was just like also practice for me to see what works in PPI. So a focus group I kind of just thought would work well, because yeah, people could just come and chat and bounce off one another. And if I just got like stuck in a really awkward interview with someone, it might like not go that well. So I just wanted them to fuel each other's discussion, which they did really well. And then what was the other question? Oh yeah, they were all in the same group, but everyone actually came from more of a lived experience position than a professor. There were people who had like done therapy with new parents and stuff, but they also were like someone that identified as either a parent or a child who had grown up in the context of depression or anxiety. So most people were discussing things through the lens of lived experience.
So can I just ask, the online, so it's pragmatic, but both of us that are planning to do something similar, do you think you lost anything by going online with practically? Because I think that is the issue we've had before, is it's hard to get everyone in the room, we want people in the room, and we've ended up with interviews because a focus group in the room is really difficult, particularly for professionals in the room. So sometimes you make the decision of, if you want them in a group, you probably have to have it online, and if you want interviews, you'll serve in-person interviews, but then we've already done them online. So it's kind of interesting. So your thoughts, now you've done it, would you do online again, even if you couldn't do anything, and would you do interviews other focus groups?
I probably, first one, interview or online versus in person. I would have no problem with doing it online again. Unless someone literally said to me like, I don't have a computer or something, and I was going to lose people who didn't have online access, although I advertised online, so they would have seen it. So if I was advertising on paper and people didn't have internet access, then I'd consider bringing it into a room. I didn't feel I lost anything online. There was a couple of those moments of like you're still on mute or whatever, but I actually think it maybe helped to keep like things a little bit more ordered, and people to kind of like, okay, your turn now, everyone else mute, and people did speak like at length. Everyone that was in this focus group had done lots of PPI work before, but not in this like sphere, not in mental health, but they all had like come thinking about it, they knew what they wanted to say. Yeah, so that, what was the second bit?
And then if focus group actually gives you more, I mean, because you did do interviews.
Oh yeah, I think that I definitely got enough for what I needed from a focus group, but I think it would be interesting to say I was going to do the quality study of what is love. I might start with a focus group, use that for some data, also for some prompts and interview question generation, and then follow up on the bits, because I still have bits of this. Like say I would love now, but I obviously need to just start like doing my PhD now. But if I could follow up with the like feeling loved thing and go and do interviews on that, because that's the avenue I'm going down, and to like pick up on the bits that you find interesting or that stick out to you or whatever from the focus group, and get that detailed like digging into the concept.
Can I say just tagging on to that, this is more of a comment than a question, so I'm that person, sorry. But when you were saying that, I've in some of my projects, I'm planning to do some interviews first and then potentially focus group later on, once things have come up in the interviews and there's something we want to dig into more. So that's another potential.
Yeah,
I don't know nearly anything enough about the quality of work to know like what is a good, is there even a right method there? But that's another way you might go about it.
Yeah, and kind of have people like bouncing off each other once you know what you want.
Yeah, like
have it a bit more focused. Yeah.
So yeah, to focus on one question or one issue or yeah. So just to suggest that maybe that's another way.
Yeah. No, I think that I don't know. Yeah, I don't know if there is a right or what I would necessarily even do.
There's no right.
Yeah.
Answer to that, but we're all calling you.
Calling newbies, yeah.
Like someone else knows more.
Probably do know more. Do you have a question?
I was wondering if you had much disagreement in the focus group. I just kind of just mentioned people bouncing off each other, and I wondered whether within a focus group context you could end up with people kind of like slightly, like in an interview setting, we kind of talk about an interviewer as in like immediately biasing the response to the participant, just by virtue of the questions they ask. Like in a focus group where people aren't worried about whether essentially what they say might influence what other people are saying, could you end up with a potentially like inflated false consensus if people don't want to be disagreeable, confrontational, or just like maybe like everyone else seems to be agreeing on this one thing and I have a very different experience, but I don't want to voice that now because I kind of feel a bit weird because everyone else seems to really agree on this one thing.
I mean, I think that definitely could happen. And given that feeling love came up as one of almost the first things, yeah, maybe other people were just like, maybe they never would have said that. And it just came into their mind of like, yeah, I do think that struck a chord. I didn't get the vibe from any of them that they were like really against disagreeing with people. I felt like they were all kind of quite, probably because they'd done a lot of this stuff before or were the kind of person that was interested in doing this kind of stuff. My impression was that they like knew what they wanted to say and they wouldn't really like care if it was not going to kind of steer me in the direction I wanted or I was going to disagree with someone else. Like some people were literally like, I don't think genetic plays any role in this at all. So yeah.
And maybe online helps for that as well.
Yeah.
Because you're not literally in the room with other people and have to, disagree to their face easier.
I was just going to add that as well with our PPI. If you're wanting to avoid that, we also have the option of breakout rooms, which are much easier to do. And then you can split people down into smaller groups. You can try and group them by certain. So we have like smokers, vapers, young people, parents, and you can split them down by those groups who are more likely to think more similarly.
and therefore might be more willing to express certain opinions with their kind of group that they feel more affiliated with. So there's that. I'm really worried that this is very interesting, but poor Amy has been filling questions for like half an hour. So is there any final burning questions, or can we? Great. Has anybody got any social notices other than the library should be very busy this evening? If anyone wants to go to that, for new people, the library is a pub just around the corner where plenty of psychology people go on a Friday. So you can usually find some people there. I think that was the only social notice I could think of. Anybody else got anything that they want to bring up?
Got a non-social notice, which is that so I've been done 2 of these workshops on kind of inference and scientific methodology now, and I've got another series that are running in November the 9th, and then session 2's on the 16th, and they're being advertised through the Bristol Doctoral College. So they're kind of hidden away in the BDC events page, but it kind of says there that it's open to PGRs, but it's literally like if you're an empirical researcher and you're like, yeah, interested in thinking about like the research process and the kind of inferences that you make therein, get in touch, and I can put it on signups or give you more information. And also, yeah, share it, spreading the word.
And you've got that. Is that on the notice board or anything on Slack?
No, but I can post an info something.
That'd be great. The other thing that I was just going to say, to make it easier for people online, because I know people in the room have been introduced, but it's really helpful if you put your pictures on Slack so that they know you're new, but they can then see what you look like as well. And a reminder for everyone else that's been here for ages that doesn't have a photo or put down their photo. I think that's everything. Have a good weekend, everyone, and maybe see you at the library. Thank you.
Thanks, Amy. Thank you.
Yeah.